Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf kaf. It's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to review one line from the previous daf that Rav said, which is that any time something is said double, twice, it's mentioned 2 times, in a mincha offering, it means it's ma'akev. It's an essential component. And then it was very clear that if it doesn't say it twice, then it's not essential. To this, we're going to have a difficulty. Matkefla Rav Huna. Rav Huna at the very bottom of Yud Tanna Bet says, Hare melach, but salting, Delo Tanna Vayikra, it doesn't say you have to do it twice, putting salt on the kmitza before you burn it, and it's an essential part. If you don't do it, you don't fulfill your obligation. How do we know this? Tanya, it says it a braita, and they quote a pasuk. Now the pasuk that's written here is brit melech olamhi, okay, which is a pasuk in Bamidbar chapter 18, verse 19. Actually, it's a very strange context to be bringing a pasuk from there. It has to do with the gifts to the Kohanim. And Tosfot basically quotes Rabbeinu Tam, who says this is not the right girsa, and right, and he uses a different pasuk, which is Lo tashbit melach brit Elohecha me'al minchatecha, okay, which is a pasuk about the mincha, and it's a much more reasonable pasuk to be using here. We're actually going to meet the pasuk later. We're going to see it inside more, but it makes more sense to be saying this is from your mincha. Don't not bring salt. So that seems to be the right pasuk. It seems to be perhaps a mistake here. Anyway, but the main point being that the braita quotes this pasuk about a covenant of salt. Shetehei brit amura b'melach divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That means Rabbi Yehuda is saying that there's a brit, there's a covenant about the salt. That means it has to be there. And Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees with him, Rabbi Shimon Omer, and we're going to see both Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda both think the salt is an essential component. And that's the problem with Rav. It's not said twice. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he uses a different pasuk. Ne'amar Kanu, his pasuk actually is the brit melech olam, who that it says in Bamidbar chapter 18. V'ne'amar lahalam brit kahunat olam. And there's another verse that says a covenant of kahuna forever. So it says there's a covenant of salt forever, and there's a covenant of kahuna forever. So kashem she'iyafshar lekorbanot below kahuna, since you can't have sacrifices without kahuna, without the Kohanim doing them, kach iyafshar lekorbanot below melach. In the same way, you can't have sacrifices without salt. So that raises a problem. Rav Huna raises a problem with that source against Rav and says, Rav, you said only if it says things twice, and it doesn't say things twice about salt in the mincha. So I'm Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, we're going to have 2 answers to this question, and then we're actually going to make an attempt to neutralize the question entirely. But first, we're going to have 2 answers. I'm Rav Yosef. Rav Katana didan svirale. Oh, Rav holds like the Tanna of our Mishna. Remember our Mishnah? Da'amar, lo malach, kasher. Okay, remember lo yatzak, lo balal, lo patat, lo malach. If you didn't do all of these actions, it continues on with a bunch more. Kshera, it's still okay. So if you didn't put salt on at all, it's fine. Rav holds not like Rabbi Yehuda, not like Rabbi Shimon. Our Tanna must hold a different position. Not exactly a third, because both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon say the same thing, just learning it from different psukim. Our Tanna holds something else and thinks that you don't have to do it. And that makes perfect sense then with Rav, who basically said, oh, it doesn't say it twice, that's why it's not essential. But Abai is going to have a bit of a problem with this, however, we'll resolve it. Amalei Abai. Abai says to me, Hachi lo yatzak nami lo yatzak klal. What? You're saying lo yatzak means you didn't put oil on, just like lo malach means you didn't use salt at all. Lo yatzak, you think it means you didn't put oil on at all? Of course you have to put oil. We already saw this before in the previous sugya on Daf Yud Chet. So how do we explain it there? Ela lo yatzak kohen elazal. What it means is a kohen didn't do it, a non-kohen did it. If a non-kohen put on the oil, it's okay. But of course you have to have yitzikah, you have to have the oil. Ha-chanami, we're going to say the same thing here. Lo malach kohen elazal. Doesn't mean you didn't salt it all. It means the kohen didn't salt it, but a non-kohen salted it. It would be okay, but of course if it wasn't salted at all, it would be a problem. In which case, what do we now have? Our Mishnah actually agrees with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, and you can't say Rav holds by that opinion because there is no opinion that you don't have to salt. But Rav Yosef comes back with a retort. Amalei, wait a minute. The salting happens on the altar. Do you think a non-Kohen can come on the altar? Of course not. Only Kohanim went on the altar. So because of that, there's no way the salting could have happened by zar, and it couldn't be. That's what the Mishnah means. The Mishnah must mean, even though the Mishnah by yatzak means you didn't do it right, a non-Kohen did it. Here, when it talks about, and we saw already, we distinguished between different cases in the Mishnah. Here also, when it says, not also differently, when it says lo malach, it means you didn't salt it at all. So there's the first answer. Rav matches that Mishnah. Okay, and says it's okay if you didn't salt it, it's not essential. Answer number 2, ibai deima, you could say, kevan dechtiva be brit, since it says brit, keman de Tanna be kadamya. The word brit makes it as if. Now, it's true, we said only if it says it twice, not any other time. But there's one exception. If it says covenant, that means there's a covenant here. That's so important that it overrides the principle of Rav, or it doesn't really override it. It fits in with it. It's like it said it twice. It's a very strong wording. Okay, there are 2 answers. But now we're going to get off on a difficulty, which is going to actually lead us into tomorrow's daf. Okay, not the difficulty that will be resolved right away, but it's really a difficulty on the difficulty. So what kind of question is this that Rav Huna asked? And then from there, we're going to answer it by bringing this whole long braita, and then we're going to go in depth into that braita, which is going to continue into tomorrow's daf. And it's all about salting. The lo Tanna Vayikra. Wait a minute. The question assumed that it doesn't say twice in the pasuk about salting the mincha. But wait, of course it does. V'haktiv v'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach. Okay, we're in chapter 2 of Vayikra, verse 13. And it says, okay, we have to read the whole pasuk. Kol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach. Any korban of your mincha that you bring has to be salted. That's 1. V'lo tashbit melach brit Elohecha me'al minchatecha. 2, and don't not have salt on your sacrifices. 3, al kol korbancha takriv melach. On every sacrifice you bring salt. Sacrifice it with salt. So there you have it, even 3 times, okay? So why are you even asking this question? Of course it repeats it. To which the answer is, hahu mebayle lechidetanya. No. The 3 mentions in that pasuk, each of those sections are needed for various drashot, and they're not, so to speak, free to say, oh, well, they're free for other things, okay? And basically saying, well, you can really learn from here something else, okay? You can learn from here something else, which means you can't say, oh, it's repeated 3 times or twice, and it's extra to teach you that it's necessary. No, those words are needed for something else. So now we're going to enter into this very long braita, and then we're going to go in depth into the braita and try to understand it better. So the braita starts off like this. Ilu ne'emal korban bimelach. If it said korban in salt, shomea ani afilu etzim v'dam, shenikru korban. I would have thought also when you put wood on the altar, or blood on the altar, they're also called a korban, because what's a korban? Something you bring to the altar, and we're going to see later where they're called korban. But because, eitzim is more difficult. Dam is easy. Dam is a korban, right? The blood. But the eitzim, even wood that you bring, you might have thought that you have to, when you burn the wood on the altar, it has to be burned with salt. And what we seem to be meaning is if you're bringing an offering of wood to the altar, which we'll see, there's a machloket about whether you can or not. Talmud lomar mincha. Okay, now it actually doesn't say the word mincha, it says minchatcha. This is in the first phrase. V'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach. Every korban of your mincha. So because it says korban, you might have thought everything. But then it says minchatcha, the korban of your mincha. That means it's not going to include not blood and not wood that you bring on the altar. Now, what do we get from mincha exactly? Well, it has to be like a mincha. Ma mincha miyuchedet she'acherim ba'im chovala. Now, a mincha is unique in the sense that there's other obligatory things that come along with it. Okay, we're going to explain this later. That it's wood, for example, is something that goes with it. That you can't bring your kometz, your kmitza, you can't burn on the altar unless there's a fire burning made of wood. So something has to come with it. Without that, you can't actually sacrifice it. We'll also learn later that the levona was also another chova. You have to bring frankincense with your mincha offering, with most of the menachot, And then, so there's an example of something that has to be obligatory that comes along with it. Without that, it's not complete. So therefore, af kol she'acherim ba'im chovala. So therefore, anything that has some other obligatory thing that has to come with it. Now, wood can just go straight on the altar, and blood can just go straight on the altar. You don't need a fire going before. Okay, so those two are out. Now, even though we just said those two are out, we're going to try again to bring blood in, because now they're going to say, wait, ima mincha miyuchedet shemateret af kol shematil. What makes a mincha miyuchedet? That it permits something. Remember, we learned with pigul, there's a matir. Well, the komets, when I burn it, it permits the rest of the remainder to be eaten by the kohanim. So maybe af kol shematil, maybe everything that's a matir would also need salt, just like the mincha. Now, what would that include then? Avidam shematil, the blood permits. What does the blood permit? It permits the meat to be burnt on the altar, or the parts that are supposed to be burned on the altar, and it permits the meat, right? Usually the imurim in an ola permits all the meat, and it permits the meat to be eaten by the kohanim or by the owner, depending on what korban. So the dam is a matir, just like the komets is a matir. That without it, you can't do the next stage. So why wouldn't you say, oh, well, maybe it should be like a mincha in the sense of the matir? So we've now have two ways that things could be, how we could define a mincha. The braita seems to be siding with it's acherim ba'im chovala. Other things are obligatory that go along with it. But they're now suggesting maybe it should be things that are permitters. This permits something else to happen. Talmud lo me'al minchatcha v'lo me'al damcha. Because it says later on in the pasuk, the next section, v'lo tashbit, do not stop having melach brit Elohecha, the God, the covenant of salt of your God, me'al minchatcha, from on your mincha. Meaning, on your mincha, the salt has to be, but not on something else. What does it exclude? The blood. Later we'll have a discussion, why doesn't this exclude something else? Now, in the next stage. So that was two stages. We tried to say, we exclude the wood and the blood, and then the second, we exclude the blood again, because it sort of sounded like it might have been included, and we've also come up with the categories of what makes a mincha unique. We have two things, but in the end, it kind of sounds like they're taking the first one more seriously, because they're saying the second one, the matir, doesn't really work because of the dam exclusion. Now we go on to the next stage. Yachol, you might have thought, maybe the whole thing needs salt, not just the komets, which gets burned. Maybe you need to put salt in the batter. Talmud lomar korban. That's why it says korban. Korban is something you sacrifice, meaning you burn on the altar. Korban, or you bring on the altar. Korban te'um melach ve'ein mincha kula tuna melach. So the whole mincha, which you don't bring to the altar, doesn't need salt. Another exclusion, but this time within the case of this mincha. Ve'ein li'ela komets. Okay, so now we get the komets. Fine. The komets, we need it. It has to have salt on it. Minayin l'rabot et halevona. How do you know the frankincense also needs to be brought with salt? Marbani et halevona shekem ba'ima b'kli echad. We're going to include the levona in the obligation of salt, because if the kmitza needs salt, and the levona goes in the sanctified vessel with the kmitza, because when you put the kmitza in the sanctified vessel, after you take out the kohen, takes out the kohen, puts it in the sanctified vessel, the next thing that happens is we put the levona in the frankincense, the frankincense in the sanctified vessel. So it's in the same sanctified vessel as the kmitza. Therefore, we're going to say if that needs salt, the other one also needs salt. So the frankincense needs salt also. Minayin lerabot et halavona haba b'fnei atzma ulevona haba b'bizichin v'aktoret. Okay, we'll stop here for a minute. How do you know that if I offer to bring an offering of frankincense, not with a mincha, by itself, that's a levona that comes by itself, or the levona that goes in the bizichin, those bowls that go on the shulchan with the lechem apanim, with the showbread, and the ketoret, when I offer the incense up, and we're going to have this whole long list of all sorts of things that have to be brought with salt. Minchat kohanim, u'minchat kohen mashiach, u'minchat nesachim. 3 menachot that get burned completely. There is no komets, the whole dough gets burned. Okay, then that's the kohanim. It's the one the kohen gadol brings, right? Anytime a kohen offers a voluntary one, there's the one the kohen gadol brings every day, twice a day, the minchat chavitim, and the mincha that goes with sacrifices, the one that's the side, right? You also bring the sachim, these libations with sacrifices. In that there's a mincha, okay? They need salt as well. Imurei chatat, also the fats that burn of the guilt offering, of the sin offering. V'imurei asham, and the guilt offering, the fatty parts that get burnt on the altar. Imurei kochim, or also of the shlamim, right, the sibor, the communal shlamim offerings that are also kochim. Imurei kochim kalim, all the kochim kalim, their parts that get burned on the altar also get burned with salt. Ve'evrei olah, all the animal parts of the olah that get burned completely. And the olah ha'of, and the olah of the bird that gets burned completely. How do you know minayin that all these have to be burned with salt? Talmud lomar al kol korbancha takriv melach. End of the pasuk. All your sacrifices. Okay, so we basically had, this is the end of the braita. We excluded the wood and the blood. We came up with a ruling that excludes them. Has to be something that has something obligatory that goes along with them. We said, but wait, why don't we say it's a matir? We said, oh no, that matir, right, wouldn't include blood because there's a special drashot to exclude blood. Okay, which it's not clear right now whether we would say that actually is a criteria. It has to be a matir, and just there's a unique exception for blood. We're going to get into that in a bit. And then we include the lavona because it goes in the bowl with it. And then we include any lavona that's brought on its own, right, any frankincense, or the ones that go with the lechem apanim, and all the other parts of the sacrifice that get burned on the altar. They all need salt. That's from al kol korbancha takriv melach. That's basically what we did. Now we're going to go back to the different parts, and we're going to a little bit reread this braita and have some different things to say about different parts of it. Amar mar, ein li ela komets, minayin lerabot talavona, marbani talavona shkem ba'im abikli echad. They're really talking about here is the whole end part, where it says, well, the lavona is also like the k'toret because it's together in a bowl, and that's why you need to have salt with it. Then we go to all the other korbanot, and we basically say, oh, it says al kol korbancha takriv melach. But the Gemara is going to ask a question. Vaha amarta, but didn't you say ma mincha miyuchedet shachirim ba'im chovala? Didn't you say that we already have this rule? What typifies a mincha? That there's obligatory things that go with it that have to happen. Well, that's true for all the korbanot. There always has to be a fire there, for example. You need wood before. So all of them have something obligatory that goes with it, in which case it doesn't really make sense that you need that other drashot. It should already be included from the mincha. So they kind of reread this braita, and even though part of it was at the beginning, part of it was at the end, they kind of pull this together, and they say the following. Hachi kamar. What it really is saying here is, they're like this. Ema, we're going to end up with a klal upratu klal, even though it doesn't say that explicitly in the braita. So they say like this. Ema, why don't you say korban klal? It starts off with v'chol korban minchatcha. Korban means any korban. That's a general principle. Mincha prat. The next word is a mincha. Sounds like that's specific. So normally when you have a klal uprat, ein biklal ala masha beprat. You're only going to include things that are just like the detail. So mincha in midyach minilo. That would basically tell you mincha yes. Anything that's not a mincha, no. But that's the right, and that's kind of the beginning part where it's excluding things. But then hadar amar. But then it says, wait, al kol korbancha. And this is where it comes to the end of the braita, even though it's kind of a mix, because we'll see in a minute what they're going to say actually came up earlier in the braita. That's why they're making like a bit of a mishmash of the braita. But when it says al kol korbancha, chazar vekalal, then it brings back the klal. And now what do we have? A klal upratu klal. So what are the rules of a klal upratu klal? You start off with a general word, then you end up with a specific word in the middle, then you end at the end with a very general term. Iyatadan elakena prat, right? When you have a klal upratu klal, the rule is it's anything that's similar to the detail. Mahaprat meforash acharim ba'im chovala, just like the prat is specific, that what's unique about the prat. Now, instead of saying it's just things that are really like the prat, like mincha offerings, no, we're going to expand it out, but only expand it out in a way that it's similar to the mincha. What typifies the mincha? Achirim ba'im chovala. There's other things that need to go along with it, like the wood, like the frankincense. Av kol shachirim ba'im chovala. So then that's the conclusion of the braita at the end. And also from the beginning they said this, right? Only things that are similar to it, excluding the wood and the blood, and including all those other things we saw at the end of the braita. Achirim deba'im chovala ma'inihu. So now they say, okay, well, what's an example of things that come as obligations with these other things? Eitzim, okay, wood. Afkol eitzim. So, right, just like wood is needed for the mincha, wood is needed for all of these other things, and that's a really good example. But now they say, Ema levona. Just like I said before, you could say levona, frankincense. Is it, right? It's something that has to happen with the kmitza. You can't, the shirayim, the remainder, isn't permitted to the kohen until you also bring the shirayim, the levona, and also the komets. So, now, okay, so what? Let's say levona. Now, if we say levona, we're now going to make an analogy. Aite dam d'ikanisachim. Levona and kmitza are two totally different things. One is incense, a frankincense. One is a dough, right? A part of the dough. Now, in the sacrifices, you have the blood, and then you also have libations. And you don't really complete everything until you do the libations as well. So now we're going to say, look, the levona is a requirement for the kmitza, which is why the kmitza needs salt, or at least it's what typifies this. So the blood also needs the libations. And if you don't do them, well, then you haven't fulfilled your obligation completely. So, or at least it has something that goes that's an obligation to bring. You might actually fulfill your obligation without it, but it is an obligation that goes along with it. So we're basically saying levona is to kmitza, as nisachim, the libations, are to the blood. If so, the blood also has something that comes as obligatory, and then it should actually be obligated to be salted. To which they answer, no, that's not a fair comparison. Because if you're going to say levona is to kmitza like nisachim is to blank, it's not going to be to the blood. Nisachim bahadi imurim hudatu. It's brought together with the imurim, and therefore it's considered a chovah for the imurim, and that works perfectly because the imurim are on our list. All those fatty parts that get burned is things that need salt. Why? My time. Why would you compare nisachim would go more to imurim than they would to blood? Tama achila. My time. Achila ushtia. What usually goes together? Food and drink. Now, what's going on the altar here? Burning the fatty parts, that's the food, and pouring the wine libations, that's the drink. Food and drink go together. So that wouldn't really be a problem for the braita, to which the Gemara says, what do you mean? Adraba, kapara v'simcha. Actually, no. I think the nisachim, the libations, go much better with the blood. Why? Because the blood is for atonement, and the wine that you pour is for happiness. Now, why do you have happiness? Well, what's the connection between atonement and happiness? Not two things I would put together as easily as eating and drinking. But no, think about the process. You get atonement, and then you thank God for giving you atonement. So those two would be the two obligations. This is the obligation for that. Without, right, the blood has an obligation that goes with it, which is bring libations. So now we're back to saying, why wouldn't the wine be similar? Why wouldn't the blood be similar and you would actually need salt on the blood? Because again, the levona, the frankincense, is to the kmitza. That is an obligation that goes with it, as is the libations with the blood. And then the blood would be in the same category as the meal offering and would need it. So the Gemara says, Ela levona ba ima b'kli achir. Echad. The reason why the levona is connected to the kmitza here is because the levona comes with the kmitza in one vessel. But nisachim ein ba'im b'kli echad. You can't make that analogy. Because nisachim, the libations, aren't put together with the blood. They're not in one vessel. What connects them to be viewed as this is an obligation for that is that they're both put together in the same vessel. Now this, by the way, is reminiscent of words in the braita, where they use that, but they use it in a completely different context. Okay, this is, again, a rereading of this braita. The braita, they used it to say the levona also needs salt, but now we're using it to say the levona is considered an obligation for the kmitza because it's also brought in the vessel together with it. Libations are so far distanced from the blood, right? It's not from the animal, it's something external, and it wasn't put in the same vessel as it. So we're not going to say that that's a chovah that comes along with it, to then say the blood would be obligated to be salted. Aval eitzim, but why does wood work as a chovah? Because ki hechad mitkashre bu mincha, hachi mitkashre pahu kulu korbanot. But the wood, since just same way it works in the same way with the mincha, it basically allows it to be burned. In that same way, it works with all the other korbanot, and that's why wood could work for where it works for. But again, wood is irrelevant for the blood. now the Gemara, that was question number one. Question number one again was, question number two really. Question number one was, why do we need that drashot at the end for all those other ones? You could have just said, right, it already came up in the beginning, the mincha is miyuchedet, that it has a chovah, and that would have included, why do you need the other pasuk? And then they say it's really a klal u'prat u'klal. You need the klal u'prat u'klal to explain all that. Okay, without a klal u'prat u'klal, you wouldn't have necessarily come to that conclusion. Then they said, okay, well, why don't we stick something else into that category? Blood actually has a chovah with it. The libations, just like the lavon, is a chovah for the kmitza. But in the end, we differentiate between them and say, no. That's something completely different that maybe, okay, one's kapara, one's simcha, they somewhat go together, but they're never really put together and they come from different sources. It's not going to be viewed in that same way as the lavon and the frank and the kmitza, which end up in the same vessel. Now the Gemara is going to ask another question. Why don't we say, just like the mincha is acherim ba'im chovala and materet. Well, there's two things that it mentioned in the brraita about the mincha. One is it has some obligation that goes along with it, that you need the wood, let's say. And the second is that it works as a matir. So, av kol shacherim ba'im chovala umateret. Maybe both those things that you typify a mincha, they have to both be in that object in order to say it needs salt. It's not enough to have one. Maybe you need both. And then what would be included and what wouldn't? Ma'inihu, where do we have something that fits both criteria? Levona haba b'bizichin. Only the levona that's in the bizichin, that what do? They not only have a chovah like everything else does, needs wood to be on the fire, but in addition, desharia lechem. It's a matir. It permits the bread to be eaten, the lechem apanim, the showbread. Whereas all the other korbanot don't permit anything. The blood is what permits it, not the sacrifice, not the burning of the parts on the altar. So, aval midyachrini lo, and then we come to the conclusion, nothing else. So, where do we get this, that you only need one criteria, not both? Now they're going to prove it from a different line in the braita. Mid'itzrich me'al minchatcha v'lo me'al damecha, michlal dehanach kulu atu b'chad sad. Now they point out the second section in the braita. The brite had said at first, maybe because of korban, we would have thought blood and wood, but in the end it says mincha, and that excludes them. But then I said, wait a minute. Once we said, and then we got to this, what's the reason for mincha? What typifies it? Well, acherim ba'im chovala. And they said, wait a minute. A mincha also is a matir, so why don't we include blood, which is a matir? And the brite is actually kind of willing to include blood for that reason, but then says, oh wait, there's a drashot. Me'al minchatcha comes to exclude not damecha, not your blood. But without that drashah, you would have included it. What do you see here? Blood is similar in how many ways? Only the matir way, not the other way. So it's obvious that they needed, from the fact that they needed a pasuk to say, no, blood is not part of it, it would have been enough without the pasuk. We would have actually included blood. And even though it's only similar in one way. So that's what they say here. Bichlal, from here you can infer the hadach kulu atu b'chad sad. Everything else, it's enough if they just have one. You either need to have the matir, again, unless you're blood, because the special drashot that says except blood, or you have to have this other issue of achirim ba'im chovala that comes with some other obligation. Okay, that's the end of that last section of the braita, which ended up touching on other parts. Now we're going to go to another section, the one we just quoted. Amar mar. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, why is that the drashot? It's obviously excluding something, but theoretically you could say, maybe it's from your mincha, not from your limbs. So they say, and then what would that mean? Not animals, right? Not animal sacrifices. And then blood, yes, would need salt, and the mincha would need salt, and maybe the frankincense, right? But not limbs of bodies, like from animals. To which the Gemara says, no, mistabra evarim havale l'ribuye. Much more likely, if we're going to include one thing and exclude the other, we're going to include the animals. Why? Because there's many similarities between animal offerings and mincha offerings. And here we're going to have a list of things that are not existent in blood, but they are existent in meal offerings and in meat offerings. So, what are they? Sheken, and there's a Rashi Tevot Siman for all the similarities to remember them, but we're just going to read the items themselves, not the siman. Achirin ba'im chovala kimota. Okay, number one, our case that we've been talking about. they require something to be on the altar when they go, right? Something to go with them. Ishim kamota. Also, it needs fire, just like the mincha needs fire. They all need to be burnt. Bechutz kamota. They're done outside the sanctuary, meaning in the azara, in the courtyard. Whereas, right, the blood sometimes is brought in the sanctuary, but these are never brought in the sanctuary. You never bring the mincha offering in the sanctuary. You never bring the animal sacrifices, burn them in the sanctuary. Another thing, no tar kamota. The meat could be left over beyond their designated time. The meal offering could be left beyond their designated time. They each have time frames in which they have to be eaten. If not, they become no tar. Tuma kamota. If you're tameh and you eat them, you're punished. You're not allowed to eat blood in any case, right? Not even if you're tameh. There's no law, special law, if you eat blood when you're impure. You're not allowed to eat blood at all. Me'ila kimota. And the last one is, there's me'ila. If you misuse sanctified property, right? The animal or the mincha offering, and you, let's say, just eat it on your own, it's a problem. But there's no me'ila in the blood. The blood doesn't have a law of me'ila if someone might use the blood for something. So there are your similarities, and that's why if we're going to say something's included and something's excluded, we're going to include the things that are more similar to mincha and say those need salt, but not the blood, which is not so similar. Turning now to Amabet, you see Amabet is very short. Adraba, you could say the opposite. You could say really blood it should have included because blood has some similarities to the mincha. Number one, Kain matir kamota. We saw this before. It's a matir. It permits other things. The burning of the parts on the altar do not permit anything. Nifsal b'shkiata chama kamota. Right? If you miss your opportunity, right? When do you miss your opportunity to do the blood? Once the sun sets. It's too late. When do you miss your opportunity to burn the mincha offering? Sunset. Too late. Whereas the meats that you burn on the altar, you can burn all night. Okay, you don't miss your opportunity at sunset. Okay, so what do you see? There are also similarities between the blood and the mincha that don't exist by the animals. To which the Gemara answers the obvious answer, which is hanach lefishin. There's way more similarities to the animals between the mincha and the animals than there is between the mincha and the blood. And that's why we're going to basically include all the animal sacrifices, exclude the blood. Now we're going to go back to another line, and now this is like going in reverse order, okay? Now we're getting closer to we're going to the first line. Amar mar, shomea ani afilu etzim v'dam, shenikru korban. Right, I would have thought that you would include the blood and the wood, because it calls it korban, and those things could be called korban. Well, and then what do we say? No, we don't, because it says minchat chan, it has to be similar to the mincha. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Man shamalei da amar eitzim ikre korban. Who's the one who says that wood could be considered a korban? Rabbi. It's actually Rabbi who says it. And Rabbi, now, if that means that the author of this braita is Rabbi, basically, he's the only one who thinks that wood could be brought as a korban and called a korban. Now, if that's the case, well, then we're going to assume, so okay, according to Rabbi, what would follow? Well, it's a korban, and yet you don't bring it with salt. But Rabbi mevaya ba'u melach. But Rabbi actually does require salt. So now we're super stuck because this doesn't make any sense. The one who says it's a korban, who could be the only one who's talking in this braita, actually says you don't need it. It needs to be brought with salt. And that's not what the braita says. The braita says wood doesn't need salt, even though it's a korban. So that's our question. But in order to further follow, to understand the question better, or just really to bring a backup for what they just said, as if like they pulled it out of nowhere, we don't know where. We're now going to see, where do we know that Rabbi says you need salt? Where do we know that Rabbi says it's korban? That wood, it could be a korban? And where do we know that Rabbi says it needs salt? And then we're going to have to answer our question. Tanya, as it says in a braita, korban mincha milamed shemitnadvim etzim. Okay, so from the words korban mincha, this is in the beginning of chapter 2 in Vayikra, where it starts off the first pasuk about the mincha. Nefesh ki takriv korban mincha lashem. A person who sacrifices a sacrifice of a meal offering. Now, it could have just said nefesh ki takriv mincha. Why does it add the word korban? So they say melamed shemitnadvim etzim. From here, you learn that you can voluntarily bring wood. Vikama, how much? If you say I'm going to bring wood, what's the minimum you need to bring? Shnei gzirim, two logs. V'chein hu omer, and here it also says, Hagoralot hipalnu al korban ha'etzim. Okay, this is in Nehemiah, where they're in the second temple, they're rebuilding, and people are bringing wood for the fire. And it says the goralot hipalnu, we did a lottery as to who was going to bring, on the korban ha'etzim. Here you see the word korban goes together with wood. Rabbi Omer, etzim korban minchahin, utiunim melach, utiunim hagasha. And then Rabbi comes and says, wood is called a mincha, and they need salt, and they need to be brought to the altar in the same way you have to bring it bring close to the altar, bring the komets close to the altar. You also have to bring the wood because it's like a korban mincha. The Amar Rava, and two more things about this opinion before we answer our question. L'divrei Rabbi, so Rava says according to Rabbi, etzim tu'unim kmitza. You also need to do kmitza. What you need to do is you need to break it up into small pieces, the lag. Then take, really, literally, the Kohen does a kmitza. He puts his fingers in, takes out the wood, and that's how it's brought. V'amar Papa, l'divrei Rabbi, etzim tzrichim etzim. Papa says, also wood needs wood. It needs, right now, here's our point. It has an obligation. You can't just put the wood. You might have thought wood could just go straight on the altar. No, there has to be a fire going first. So there's a chovah, right? So now the problem really is that the person who says you need a korban, that a korban wood could be called a korban, which is how the braita starts off, also thinks you need salt. So our braita doesn't make any sense, to which they say, okay, smei mikan etzim, erase etzim, take it off here. It's just blood. Okay? So now, let's go back to the braita for a minute. Okay, and then we're going to end almost. But the braita starts off, the first part of the braita was, you might have thought that blood is called a korban. We got rid of wood, so just blood. Well, it says mincha. Minchatcha. It means mincha, only things that are like a mincha, not blood. And we said, wait a minute. But blood is a matir. And then they said, well, me'al minchatcha, a different part of the phrase in that pasuk, comes to exclude blood. So the Gemara says, it's a little weird. When the wood was still in there, fine. So it was wood in the beginning, and then it really got to blood, even though blood was mentioned in the beginning. But ela krala miutemai. So what's the pasuk coming to exclude if it's not coming to exclude the wood? The first pasuk, minchatcha, is coming to exclude the blood, right? Either miute dam, but if you say it's blood, me'al minchatcha nafka. They don't really learn it. That drashot, minchatcha, ends up being kind of pushed aside because in the end, the blood is really learned from the next phrase, me'al minchatcha, not me'al damecha, not on your blood. So now, right, if we still had wood in there, we would have said, well, really, minchatcha, we thought it was coming for blood, then we kind of said, oh no, the next phrase is coming for blood. But then what's the first phrase coming for? It's not coming for wood. So now we're a little bit stuck, and we'll have to wait till tomorrow's daf to figure out how to resolve this. So let's do a quick review. We started out with Rav, who said if it says it twice, it's essential, but not if it doesn't. What about this melach, which doesn't say it twice and clearly is essential? To which they say, and how do we know? Because Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon both say it's essential. But either Rav Yosef said, well, maybe the Tanna of our Mishna doesn't think it's essential. And then Rav holds like that. Or, if you don't want to say that, then you could just say that the word brit makes it as if it was said twice. Then we questioned, why don't you say that in this pasuk about the mincha, it says melach a few times, and maybe that's the pasuk from where we learn it's ma'akeh. From that, where it's essential. And then we don't even have a question against Rav. From that, the Gemara said, oh no, we need all that pasuk for a braita. And that's what we did. We darshaned all those words in the braita, and therefore those words are not free to say that you need salt, right? Even though it said it kind of 3 times in that pasuk, each time it was needed for something else. And what was it needed for? Well, there's a klal u'prat u'klal, say only things that are like the mincha, and that excluded the blood and the wood. It included all the sacrifices, and it included the frankincense as well. Okay, and with that, we had some other ins and outs there and tried to reorganize and refigure out what the braita is talking about. We're still left with the question, and we're going to continue with this tomorrow. And in the next daf, on Sunday's daf, wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and Shavuot Tov.